My son-in-law didn't just turn my daughter against me. He orchestrated a calculated plan to strip me of everything I'd built over decades, my company, my reputation, and most painfully, my relationship with my only child and grandchildren. All with the help of a corrupt legal system he thought he owned. But the game they were playing had rules they didn't understand, because I'd been studying their playbook for longer than they realized. And before this nightmare ended, they would learn exactly what happens when you underestimate a man who spent his entire career outmaneuvering people far more dangerous than them. Have you ever faced a betrayal so deep, it forced you to question everything you believed about family loyalty? Share your thoughts below. Your story might remind someone that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who can hurt us most, but also that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried. My name is Garrett Thorne. I'm 62 years old, and this is the story of how I turned the most devastating betrayal of my life into a masterclass in patience, strategy, and ultimately, justice. The fluorescent lights in my corner office hummed their familiar tune as I stared at the stack of legal documents scattered across my mahogany desk. Outside, Seattle's skyline stretched endlessly under a gray November sky, but I barely noticed. My attention was fixed on the surveillance footage playing silently on my laptop screen. Footage I'd extracted from what my son-in-law thought was his private, encrypted cloud storage. The video showed my daughter Jessica sitting in an upscale downtown restaurant, her wedding ring conspicuously absent from her finger. Across from her sat Derek Castellano, the man I'd welcomed into our family 5 years ago with open arms and genuine hope. The man I'd mentored, guided through his early career struggles and ultimately helped establish his own legal practice. The man who was now orchestrating my complete destruction while convincing my daughter that I was the villain in their story. Derek's mouth moved animatedly as he gestured toward a thick folder between them. Even without audio, his body language screamed triumph. Jessica nodded along, her expression a mixture of determination and something that chilled me to the bone. A coldness I'd never seen in my daughter before. This wasn't the bright-eyed girl who used to climb onto my lap to hear bedtime stories about brave knights and clever princesses. This was a stranger wearing my daughter's face, plotting my downfall with the calculating precision of someone who'd learned to view me as an obstacle rather than her father. I paused the video and leaned back in my leather chair, processing what I'd just witnessed. The timestamp showed this meeting had taken place 3 weeks ago, the same week Derek had started making subtle inquiries about my business practices to mutual acquaintances. The same week Jessica had suddenly stopped bringing the grandchildren over for our traditional Sunday dinners, citing vague scheduling conflicts that never quite made sense. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant. "Your 3 p.m. appointment is here, Mr. Thorne." I glanced at my calendar, though I already knew what awaited me. Lawrence Fitzgerald, one of Seattle's most notorious divorce attorneys, representing Jessica in what Derek had convinced her was a necessary step to protect the family's future interests. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was about to be served papers by my own daughter's lawyer in my own office, surrounded by the empire I'd built from nothing over the past 35 years. "Send him in, Margaret," I replied, closing the laptop and straightening my tie. Lawrence Fitzgerald swept into my office like a man accustomed to intimidating his opponents through sheer presence. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, he carried himself with the arrogant confidence of someone who'd never lost a case he truly cared about winning. Behind him trailed a younger associate carrying a briefcase that undoubtedly contained documents designed to dismantle everything I'd worked for. "Garrett," Lawrence said, extending his hand with the kind of firm grip that was supposed to establish dominance. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." I shook his hand briefly, gesturing to the chairs across from my desk. "Please sit, though I suspect we both know why you're here." Lawrence settled into his chair with practiced ease, while his associate, a nervous-looking kid who couldn't have been more than 2 years out of law school, fumbled with the briefcase locks. The older attorney's eyes swept across my office, taking in the awards lining the walls, the photographs of groundbreaking ceremonies and ribbon cuttings, the physical manifestation of 3 decades of relentless work and strategic thinking. "Impressive," he said. though his tone suggested he found it more overwhelming than admirable. You've built quite an empire here, Garrett. Thorn Industries. What is it now? Real estate development, construction, property management? I believe Forbes estimated your net worth at just north of $800 million last year. I remained silent, watching him carefully. This wasn't small talk. It was reconnaissance. Lawrence was cataloging everything he planned to claim on behalf of my daughter, assessing the scope of the financial battlefield he was about to create. But empires, he continued, pulling a thick manila folder from his briefcase, can be complicated things, especially when family disputes arise, especially when there are questions about how those empires were built. He slid the folder across my desk with the theatrical flair of a man who enjoyed dramatic revelations. These are preliminary papers, Garrett. Jessica is seeking legal separation of all business interests currently held jointly with you, immediate cessation of your involvement in decisions regarding the grandchildren's welfare and education, and a comprehensive forensic audit of all Thorn Industries financial records dating back 15 years. I opened the folder, scanning the legal language that essentially amounted to a declaration of war. My daughter was claiming I'd been using company resources for personal gain, that my increasingly erratic behavior posed a risk to the family's financial stability, and that my relationship with the children was potentially harmful to their emotional development. Each accusation was carefully crafted, precisely worded to suggest impropriety without making specific allegations that could be easily disproven. This wasn't the work of a young lawyer in over his head. This bore the hallmarks of Derek's calculating mind, supported by Lawrence's reputation for destroying his opponents through procedural warfare. These are serious accusations, I said finally, closing the folder and setting it aside. I assume Jessica is prepared to substantiate them? Lawrence's smile was predatory. Your daughter has been documenting concerning patterns for months, Garrett. Late-night phone calls about business matters that affect family finances. Unexplained trips that coincide with major property acquisitions. Questions about whether Thorn Industries has been properly reporting income, properly handling employee benefits, properly maintaining the ethical standards that municipal contracts require. The threat was clear. They weren't just attacking me personally. They were going after the business relationships and government contracts that formed the backbone of my company. Derek had obviously spent considerable time studying my operation, looking for vulnerabilities he could exploit through legal pressure and public scrutiny. And of course, Lawrence continued, there's the matter of your recent behavior toward Derek himself. Jessica feels that your opposition to certain business decisions he's made has crossed the line into harassment. There's documentation of several heated confrontations, instances where you've used your influence to interfere with his professional relationships. I felt my jaw tighten slightly. The heated confrontations he referenced were conversations where I'd tried to warn Jessica about Derek's increasingly reckless business practices, his tendency to over-leverage client investments, and his growing reputation for cutting ethical corners when convenient. But Derek had apparently reframed my concerns as jealousy, my protective instincts as controlling behavior. I see, I said quietly. And what exactly is Jessica hoping to accomplish with this separation? Lawrence leaned forward, sensing what he mistook for weakness in my subdued response. Full control of her inherited interests in Thorn Industries, which by our calculation represents approximately 40% of the company's total value. Establishment of a trust fund for the grandchildren that removes your direct influence over their financial future. And most importantly, legal recognition that Derek Castellano has been appointed as the family's primary financial advisor and decision-maker regarding all joint assets. There it was, the real goal. Derek didn't just want to hurt me. He wanted to assume control of everything I'd built. He'd convinced Jessica that I was the problem, that my old-fashioned approach to business was holding back the family's potential, and that his modern, aggressive strategies were the key to expanding our wealth. What he didn't realize was that I'd been anticipating this move for months. I reached into my desk drawer, pulling out a sealed envelope that I'd prepared weeks ago, when my surveillance of Derek's activities had first confirmed my worst suspicions. Lawrence watched with obvious curiosity as I placed it on the desk between us. Before we proceed with any of these arrangements, I said calmly, I think Derek should see this. Consider it a professional courtesy. Lawrence frowned, clearly not expecting this response. His associate looked up from his note-taking, sensing the shift in atmosphere. What is it? Lawrence asked, though his tone suggested he was already concerned about the answer. Evidence, I replied simply. Evidence that your client might want to review before deciding how aggressively he wants to pursue this course of action. I stood up, straightening my suit jacket with the same calm precision I'd maintained throughout the meeting. You can schedule a follow-up appointment with Margaret once Derek has had a chance to examine the contents. I have a feeling his enthusiasm for this legal action may diminish somewhat. Lawrence picked up the envelope, turning it over in his hands as if it might explode. His practiced confidence was wavering, replaced by the cautious uncertainty of a predator who just realized his prey might have teeth. What kind of evidence are we talking about, Garrett? I walked around the desk, stopping at my office door and opening it with deliberate calm. The kind that tends to make ambitious young lawyers reconsider their career trajectories. Good afternoon, Lawrence, gentlemen. As they filed out of my office, the younger associate clutching his briefcase while Lawrence gripped the envelope like it contained a live grenade, I felt the first stirrings of satisfaction I'd experienced in months. The opening move had been played, and while Derek might have thought he was controlling the game, he was about to learn that I'd been several moves ahead from the beginning. After they left, I returned to my laptop and opened a different folder, one containing months of research, surveillance footage, financial records, and documented evidence of activities that Derek Castellano had assumed would never see the light of day. The game was just beginning. To understand how we reached this moment of betrayal, you need to know the story of how Derek Castellano became part of our family, and how I gradually discovered that everything I'd believed about him was a carefully constructed lie. It was a crisp October evening in 2019 when Jessica first brought Derek to one of our family dinners. I remember the date precisely because it was also the day I'd closed the largest real estate deal in Thorn Industries history, a mixed-use development project that would reshape Seattle's waterfront district and establish us as one of the premier development companies in the Pacific Northwest. I was in a celebratory mood, eager to share the victory with my daughter and meet the man she'd been mentioning in increasingly frequent phone calls. Jessica had been vague about Derek's background, describing him only as brilliant and ambitious, adjectives that, coming from my analytically minded daughter, carried significant weight. Derek arrived dressed immaculately in a navy suit that fit him perfectly, his dark hair styled with just enough casualness to seem approachable without appearing unprofessional. When he shook my hand, his grip was firm but not aggressive, and his eye contact was direct without being challenging. Everything about his presentation suggested someone who understood the importance of first impressions. Mr. Thorne, he said with genuine-seeming warmth, Jessica has told me so much about you. I've been following Thorn Industries' work for years. The Harborview project was absolutely brilliant. The way you integrated affordable housing units while maintaining profitability was masterful. I was impressed despite myself. Most people Jessica's age viewed real estate development as either soulless capitalism or boring technical work. Derek not only understood the business complexities but had clearly researched my company's approach to balancing profit with social responsibility. Throughout dinner, he asked thoughtful questions about market trends, regulatory challenges, and the strategic decisions behind my major projects. He listened intently to my explanations, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated both genuine curiosity and impressive business acumen. When Jessica excused herself to check on dessert, Derek leaned forward conspiratorially. I have to ask, he said quietly, how do you maintain such strong relationships with the City Planning Commission? I've seen companies with similar track records get bogged down in permitting battles for years. It was exactly the kind of question that revealed deep understanding of the industry's real challenges. I found myself explaining my philosophy of transparent communication and long-term relationship building, sharing insights I rarely discussed outside of my inner circle of business partners. By the end of the evening, I was genuinely impressed. Derek seemed to possess the rare combination of intelligence, ambition, and ethical grounding that I'd always hoped Jessica would find in a partner. When they left together, her hand naturally finding his as they walked to his car, I felt a sense of satisfaction I hadn't experienced since Jessica's college graduation. Over the following months, Derek became a regular presence at family gatherings. He was unfailingly polite to my wife, Catherine, genuinely interested in hearing about my younger brother's military service, and remarkably patient with my elderly mother's increasingly repetitive stories about her childhood during the Great Depression. He seemed to understand instinctively how to navigate family dynamics, contributing to conversations without dominating them, showing respect for our traditions while bringing his own perspectives to discussions. More importantly, he made Jessica happy in ways I hadn't seen since her difficult divorce 3 years earlier. Her ex-husband had been a self-absorbed pharmaceutical sales representative who'd viewed Jessica's inherited wealth as his personal ATM, while contributing nothing meaningful to their relationship. Derek was different, or so it seemed. He had his own career goals, his own professional identity, and he spoke about wanting to build something lasting with Jessica, rather than simply enjoying the benefits of her family connections. When Derek mentioned that he was considering starting his own legal practice, I saw an opportunity to help someone who genuinely seemed to deserve it. The legal industry in Seattle was dominated by established firms with deep roots and extensive client networks. Breaking into that market required not just legal expertise but also credibility, connections, and often substantial financial backing. I offered to help in ways that felt natural and appropriate. When Derek mentioned he was looking for office space, I happened to know about a perfect suite in a prestigious downtown building where Thorne Industries had significant influence with the property management company. When he expressed concerns about building a client base, I was able to introduce him to several business associates who needed legal services. When he worried about the financial risks of starting a practice from scratch, I offered to provide some initial investment capital, not as charity, but as a genuine business partnership between family members. Derek's gratitude seemed sincere and proportionate. He insisted on formal contracts for everything, refused to accept more help than he could reasonably repay, and kept meticulous records of every favor and introduction. He spoke frequently about his determination to prove himself worthy of the opportunities he'd been given, and his work ethic was genuinely impressive. Within 18 months, Castellano Legal Services had established itself as one of Seattle's most promising boutique firms. Derek specialized in commercial real estate law, corporate formations, and contract negotiations, areas where his connection to Thorne Industries provided valuable insights without creating conflicts of interest. His client base grew steadily. His reputation for thorough preparation and creative problem-solving spread through the business community, and his financial success allowed him to repay my initial investment ahead of schedule. When he proposed to Jessica in December 2020, at a private dinner in the Space Needle restaurant overlooking the city lights, I was genuinely happy for them both. The engagement ring was tasteful and expensive without being ostentatious, and Derek's proposal speech, which Jessica recounted to us in tearful detail, struck all the right notes about partnership, shared dreams, and building a future together. Their wedding, held at our family estate in the San Juan Islands, was elegant and intimate. Derek's family was smaller than ours. His parents had died in a car accident when he was in law school, and he had only a few close friends and distant relatives in attendance. But what struck me most was how seamlessly he'd integrated into our extended network of friends and business associates. During the reception, I watched him move effortlessly between conversations with Jessica's childhood friends, my business partners, and Catherine's book club members, adapting his communication style to each group while maintaining the same genuine warmth. The first year of their marriage was everything I'd hoped it would be. Jessica seemed more confident and focused than she'd been since her first marriage fell apart. Derek continued building his practice while becoming increasingly involved in Thorne Industries projects as an external legal consultant. We developed a comfortable working relationship where I could leverage his expertise while he gained valuable experience with larger, more complex deals. It was during this period that Derek began demonstrating what I initially interpreted as admirable ambition. He would stay late at the office reviewing contracts, spend weekends researching case law for upcoming negotiations, and frequently call me with questions about strategic decisions that went beyond simple legal compliance. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding not just the legal framework of our business, but the underlying economic principles and market dynamics that drove our success. Looking back now, with the benefit of bitter experience, I can see that Derek was conducting reconnaissance. Every question about our financial structures, every inquiry about our relationships with city officials, every casual conversation about our most profitable projects was part of a systematic intelligence-gathering operation. He was learning our vulnerabilities, mapping our business relationships, and identifying the pressure points where a coordinated legal attack could inflict maximum damage. But at the time, I interpreted his curiosity as the natural interest of a bright young man trying to learn from someone with more experience. I was flattered by his attention, impressed by his questions, and genuinely pleased to have someone in the family who shared my passion for the intricacies of business strategy. The twins, Emma and Jack, arrived in early 2022, and Derek's transformation into a devoted father seemed to complete his integration into our family. He was patient during the sleepless early months, supportive during Jessica's recovery from a difficult pregnancy, and genuinely excited about the responsibilities of parenthood. When I held my grandchildren for the first time, watching Derek's face as he gazed at them with obvious love and protectiveness, I felt a deep satisfaction that extended far beyond personal happiness. This was continuity. This was legacy. Derek wasn't just Jessica's husband and the father of my grandchildren. He was going to be the bridge between my generation and the next, carrying forward the values and principles that had built Thorn Industries while adapting them to changing times and new challenges. I began involving him more directly in strategic business decisions, seeking his legal perspective on acquisitions and development projects. I introduced him to key figures in Seattle's political and business communities, vouching for his character and competence in ways that opened doors that would have remained closed for years to someone without family connections. Most significantly, I began sharing information about Thorn Industries' long-term strategic plans, projects still in development, potential acquisitions we were considering, and market opportunities that weren't yet public knowledge. This wasn't just professional consultation. It was the kind of privileged information that gets shared within family circles, based on trust and shared interests. Derek absorbed it all with the same focused attention he'd always shown, asking insightful questions and offering thoughtful suggestions that often improved our final decisions. He seemed to understand intuitively that with access to inside information came responsibilities, not just legal obligations to avoid insider trading or conflicts of interest, but ethical obligations to use his knowledge in ways that served the family's best interests. It was around this time, in late 2022, that I began noticing subtle changes in Derek's behavior and priorities. Nothing dramatic or obviously concerning, just small shifts that, individually, could be explained by the normal pressures of building a career and raising young children. He became less available for casual conversations about business matters, often seeming distracted when I sought his input on decisions that would have previously captured his full attention. When he did offer advice, it increasingly focused on legal technicalities rather than strategic considerations, as if he was pulling back from the broader business discussions we'd enjoyed during his first few years in the family. His own client base was expanding rapidly, which I initially attributed to his growing reputation and the referrals that naturally flow from successful work. But I began hearing his name in contexts that surprised me, representing clients in transactions that competed directly with Thorn Industries projects, taking on cases that required expertise in areas where he'd previously claimed limited knowledge. Most puzzling was his sudden interest in certain aspects of Thorn Industries' operations that seemed peripheral to his legal specializations. He began asking detailed questions about our employee benefits programs, our relationships with subcontractors, and our compliance procedures for environmental regulations. When I asked why he was curious about these areas, his explanations were vague and unsatisfying, suggestions that he was considering expanding his practice into labor law or environmental compliance work. The first clear warning sign came during a family dinner in March 2023. Derek arrived late, apologizing for a client meeting that had run longer than expected. During casual conversation, he mentioned that he'd recently been retained by a group of investors who were considering major real estate projects in the Seattle area. "Anyone I might know?" I asked, genuinely curious about potential competitors or partners in the local market. Derek's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "I'm not sure I can discuss the details yet," he said. "Confidentiality agreements, you know how it is." It was a reasonable response. Attorney-client privilege is fundamental to legal practice, and Derek had always been scrupulous about maintaining appropriate boundaries. But something in his tone suggested the secrecy went beyond professional ethics. There was a defensiveness I'd never heard before, as if the question itself was inappropriate rather than simply unanswerable, due to legal constraints. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention to Derek's professional activities. Not surveillance, not yet, but the kind of heightened awareness that develops when instincts suggest something isn't quite right. I noticed that his office seemed busier than usual, with unfamiliar faces coming and going at odd hours. I observed that he'd hired several new associates, expanding his practice faster than his established client base would seem to justify. Most concerning was a conversation I overheard between Derek and Jessica during a family barbecue in April. They were standing near the pool, speaking in low voices while the children played nearby. I wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but their body language suggested tension, and Derek's words carried clearly across the water. "Just need to be patient a little longer," he was saying. "Once everything is properly documented, we'll have options that don't exist right now." Jessica's response was quieter, but her obvious anxiety was unmistakable. "I still don't understand why we can't just talk to him directly. He's always been reasonable about business decisions." "Because this isn't just about business," Derek replied sharply. "This is about positioning ourselves for the future, making sure we're not dependent on decisions that might not always align with our interests." The conversation ended when one of the twins called for Jessica's attention, but Derek's words echoed in my mind for days afterward. What options was he referring to? What kind of positioning required secrecy from family members? And why did he seem to view my decision-making authority as a potential obstacle rather than a resource? I began conducting discreet inquiries through my network of business contacts, asking casual questions about Derek's recent activities and client relationships. What I learned was disturbing, though not yet clearly threatening. Derek had indeed been retained by several investment groups that were actively competing with Thorne Industries for lucrative development projects. He'd been present at city planning meetings where our proposals were being discussed, ostensibly representing other interests, but positioned to observe our strategies and preparations. More troubling was information suggesting that Derek had been meeting regularly with Lawrence Fitzgerald, the same attorney who would later serve me with legal papers in my office. These weren't chance encounters at bar association events, but scheduled meetings at Fitzgerald's office, sometimes lasting several hours. By summer 2023, I'd reached the uncomfortable conclusion that Derek was playing a longer, more complex game than I'd realized. The evidence wasn't definitive enough to justify direct confrontation, but the pattern was clear enough to warrant protective measures. I began limiting Derek's access to sensitive information about Thorne Industries' operations, sharing only details that were already approaching public disclosure. I started conducting more business meetings away from the office, in locations where Derek couldn't easily insert himself into conversations. Most importantly, I began documenting everything, recording phone calls, saving email exchanges, and maintaining detailed records of every interaction that might later become relevant. Derek seemed to sense the shift in my behavior, though he never addressed it directly. His questions became more pointed, his frustration with my evasive answers more obvious. During family gatherings, he would make comments about transparency and trust that felt like coded messages about my growing reluctance to include him in business decisions. The tension came to a head during a supposedly casual conversation in September 2023. Derek had stopped by my office ostensibly to discuss some minor legal documents, but his real agenda became clear when he began questioning my recent decision to restructure certain aspects of Thorn Industries' ownership and management. "I'm concerned that these changes might create unnecessary complications," he said, his lawyer's instincts clearly engaged. "Jessica has legitimate interests in the company's direction, and some of these new structures seem designed to limit her input on major decisions." It was a careful way of saying that he'd noticed my efforts to protect sensitive information and consolidate decision-making authority. His concern for Jessica's interests was touching, except that Jessica had never expressed any desire for greater involvement in day-to-day business operations. "The changes are designed to improve efficiency and reduce potential conflicts of interest," I replied diplomatically. "As the company grows, it becomes important to maintain clear boundaries between family relationships and business responsibilities." Derek's smile was thin and humorless. "Of course, though I hope those boundaries don't become barriers to legitimate family interests." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Derek was positioning himself as Jessica's advocate against my supposedly unreasonable control over family assets. He was framing my protective measures as selfishness, my caution as obstruction of his wife's rights. That evening I made the decision to begin comprehensive surveillance of Derek's activities, not out of paranoia, but out of recognition that I was dealing with someone far more sophisticated and dangerous than I'd initially realized. What I discovered over the following months confirmed my worst fears and revealed betrayals that went far deeper than simple business competition. The private investigation firm I hired was run by Elena Santos, a former FBI agent who'd established her agency after retiring from 23 years of federal service. Elena's reputation was built on discretion, thoroughness, and an almost supernatural ability to uncover information that other investigators missed. When I first contacted her in October 2023, I was careful to frame my request in terms of general business security rather than family surveillance. "I need a comprehensive background check on someone who's become integral to my company's operations," I explained during our initial meeting in her downtown office. "Nothing inappropriate, just the kind of due diligence I should have conducted before establishing such close business relationships." Elena studied me with the penetrating gaze of someone who'd spent decades reading between the lines of client requests. "Mr. Thorne, comprehensive background checks don't typically require meetings in person. Most clients are satisfied with standard reports delivered electronically. What specific concerns are driving this request?" I appreciated her directness. "The subject has access to sensitive information about Thorn Industries' operations, future plans, and financial structures. Recently, I've become concerned that this access might be creating conflicts of interest that weren't apparent when our relationship began." "And the subject is?" "Derek Castellano, my son-in-law." Elena's expression didn't change, but her notepad appeared in her hands as if materialized from thin air. "Family investigations require special handling, Mr. Thorne. They tend to uncover information that can't be unknown once discovered. Are you prepared for whatever we might find?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been wrestling with since making the decision to hire professional investigators. Once Elena began digging into Derek's background and current activities, there would be no pretending ignorance if she discovered evidence of betrayal or criminal activity. I would be forced to act on whatever information emerged regardless of the personal consequences. "I'm prepared," I told her. "My primary obligation is to protect my family and my company. If Derek is who he appears to be, this investigation will confirm that and allow me to proceed with complete confidence. If he's not, then you'll have the information necessary to make difficult decisions," Elena finished. "Understood. What's your timeline?" "As comprehensive as possible, as quickly as possible. Money is not a constraint." Elena's preliminary report arrived 2 weeks later, and its contents were far more disturbing than I'd anticipated. Derek Castellano's background wasn't just misleading, significant portions of it were completely fabricated. The law degree from Columbia University was real, as was his admission to the Washington State Bar Association. His academic record showed strong performance, particularly in courses related to commercial law and contract negotiations. But his personal history, the foundation story he'd shared with Jessica and our family, was largely fictional. Derek's parents hadn't died in a tragic car accident during his law school years. According to Elena's research, his father, Vincent Castellano, was alive and serving a federal prison sentence for wire fraud and money laundering. His mother, Maria, had divorced Vincent in 2018 and was currently living under an assumed name in Phoenix, Arizona, apparently to distance herself from her ex-husband's criminal reputation. The small family business Derek claimed to have grown up around was actually a sophisticated financial fraud operation that had stolen millions of dollars from elderly investors across multiple states. Vincent Castellano had used his charm and apparent respectability to gain access to retirement communities, church groups, and social organizations, where he sold fake investment opportunities backed by non-existent real estate projects. Derek had been questioned by federal investigators during his father's prosecution, though he was ultimately cleared of direct involvement in the fraud scheme. However, Elena's sources suggested that Derek's cooperation with investigators had been motivated more by self-preservation than genuine ignorance of his father's activities. Subject appears to have provided federal prosecutors with detailed information about his father's operations, including financial records and communication logs, that suggest extensive knowledge of fraudulent activities, Elena's report noted. This cooperation was instrumental in securing Vincent Castellano's conviction and may have prevented additional charges being filed against other family members. Derek's law school years hadn't been the struggle against financial hardship that he'd described to Jessica. Instead, he'd been supported by funds that federal investigators later determined came from his father's fraudulent investments. When those funds were frozen during the criminal investigation, Derek had quickly secured private loans from sources that Elena's team couldn't fully identify, a concerning detail that suggested ongoing connections to questionable financial networks. Even more troubling was information about Derek's activities during the 2 years between law school graduation and meeting Jessica. He'd claimed to have worked for a small Seattle law firm specializing in immigration law, describing it as noble but financially challenging work that had left him struggling to establish his career. Elena's investigation revealed a very different story. Derek had indeed worked for the immigration law firm, but in a capacity far more sophisticated than simple case preparation. He'd been involved in what appeared to be a complex operation helping wealthy foreign nationals establish residency in the United States through questionable investment schemes. While technically legal, these arrangements operated in ethical gray areas and generated enormous fees for the participating attorneys. Subject's role appears to have involved identifying high-net-worth individuals seeking expedited residency processes, facilitating connections between these clients and investment opportunities that satisfied federal requirements while maximizing financial returns to the law firm and associated partners, Elena's report explained. Compensation structure suggests subject earned substantial commissions beyond base salary, contradicting claims of financial struggles during this period. Derek's sudden departure from the immigration firm coincided with a federal investigation into questionable EB-5 visa applications, a connection that Elena's team had uncovered through courthouse records and interviews with former colleagues. While Derek was never formally charged, several of his former clients had been subjected to enhanced scrutiny from immigration authorities, and at least 2 had faced deportation proceedings. But the most shocking revelation came when Elena's team examined Derek's financial records during the period when he was supposedly building his relationship with Jessica. The romantic narrative Derek had constructed, a struggling young lawyer charmed by an intelligent, successful woman, was undermined by evidence of substantial income from sources he'd never disclosed. Bank records showed regular deposits from multiple offshore accounts, payments that were structured to avoid reporting requirements and routed through shell corporations with no apparent legitimate business purpose. The amounts were significant, often exceeding what Derek claimed to earn from his legitimate legal practice by orders of magnitude. Subject's financial profile during courtship period is inconsistent with claimed income sources and career trajectory, Elena noted. Pattern of deposits suggests ongoing involvement in activities not reflected in professional records or tax filings. When I received Elena's preliminary report, I sat in my study until nearly dawn, reading through the documentation and trying to process the implications. The man I'd welcomed into my family, the father of my grandchildren, the person I'd trusted with sensitive information about my business operations, was not just a liar. He was potentially a criminal with ongoing connections to financial fraud networks. But Elena was far from finished. Her preliminary investigation had focused primarily on Derek's background and financial history. The second phase of her work would examine his current activities, his business relationships, and most importantly, his recent interactions with people and organizations that might threaten Thorn Industries' interests. 3 weeks later, Elena requested another in-person meeting. When she arrived at my office carrying 2 thick folders and a laptop computer, her expression was grim. "Mr. Thorn," she began without preamble, "we need to discuss immediate threats to your business and personal security. Derek Castellano isn't just concealing his background, he's actively working to damage your company while positioning himself to benefit from that damage." She opened her laptop and showed me a series of photographs taken over the previous month. Derek meeting with Lawrence Fitzgerald at an upscale restaurant. Derek entering the offices of Meridian Capital Partners, a predatory investment firm known for hostile takeovers. Derek having coffee with Marcus Webb, a city planning commissioner who'd been rumored for years to accept bribes in exchange for favorable zoning decisions. "These aren't coincidental encounters," Elena explained. "We've documented systematic meetings with individuals and organizations that have direct interests in disrupting Thorn Industries' operations. The pattern suggests a coordinated campaign designed to create legal, financial, and regulatory pressure from multiple directions simultaneously." The photographs were damaging enough, but Elena's investigation had uncovered something far worse. Through carefully placed surveillance equipment, installed legally in public spaces where Derek conducted his business, her team had recorded portions of conversations that revealed the true scope of his betrayal. "Derek has been providing detailed information about your company's upcoming projects to competitors," Elena reported. "Not just general market intelligence, but specific details about your bidding strategies, your relationships with contractors, your planned timelines for development phases. This information is being used to undercut your proposals and create artificial competition for projects where Thorn Industries would normally have significant advantages." She played audio recordings that made my blood run cold. Derek's voice was clearly audible, discussing Thorn Industries' confidential strategies with people who had no legitimate reason to possess such information. "The Harbor District project timeline has been moved up," Derek was saying in one recording. "Garrett's planning to submit preliminary proposals by February 15th, but he's concerned about the environmental impact assessments. If someone were to file challenges during the public comment period, it would delay approval by at least 6 months and potentially force him to redesign the entire southern section." Another recording captured Derek providing even more damaging intelligence. "Thorn Industries is leveraged pretty heavily on the east side expansion. Garrett's financing depends on closing the Morrison property acquisition by December. If that falls through, he'll be forced to scale back 3 other projects and lay off about 40 employees. The cash flow implications would be significant." Elena paused the recording and looked at me gravely. "Mr. Thorn, Derek isn't just sharing general business information. He's providing your competitors with strategic intelligence that could only come from someone with access to your most confidential planning sessions and financial projections." The final recording was the most devastating. Derek's voice was tense, almost desperate, as he spoke to someone Elena's team had identified as Raymond Torres, a notorious corporate raider who specialized in distressed acquisitions. "The forensic audit is scheduled for next month," Derek was explaining. "Lawrence has crafted the legal framework to make it as invasive and disruptive as possible. We're not looking for actual violations. We're creating enough legal uncertainty to make Garrett's bank nervous about extending credit lines. Once his liquidity gets tight, he'll be forced to consider partnership opportunities or asset sales." "And you're confident he won't discover your involvement?" Torres asked. Derek's laugh was bitter and cold. "Garrett thinks I'm family. He's so focused on protecting Jessica and the kids that he can't see what's happening right in front of him. By the time he realizes the scope of this operation, We'll have legal control of 40% of his company and enough leverage to force him into decisions he would never make voluntarily. Elena stopped the recording and closed the laptop. The silence in my office felt overwhelming, filled with the weight of betrayal that went far deeper than simple business competition. "How long has this been going on?" I asked quietly. "Based on our investigation, Derek began making contact with these networks approximately 18 months ago. The systematic intelligence gathering started shortly after your granddaughter's first birthday party. We found evidence suggesting he began photographing documents and recording conversations during family gatherings around that time." 18 months. Derek had been planning this betrayal for over a year, using family celebrations and intimate moments to gather intelligence that he was selling to my competitors and enemies. Every question about business strategy, every casual conversation about upcoming projects, every moment of trust and openness had been weaponized against me. "There's more," Elena continued, opening the second folder. "Derek's financial records show payments from multiple sources that align with significant setbacks your company has experienced over the past year. The zoning challenges on the Riverside project, the environmental complaints that delayed the marina development, the sudden labor disputes at 3 construction sites. We have evidence suggesting Derek provided information that enabled coordinated attacks on each of these projects." She handed me a detailed timeline that correlated Derek's meetings with various individuals to specific problems that had plagued Thorn Industries' operations. The pattern was undeniable. Every major obstacle we'd faced had been preceded by Derek sharing strategic information with people positioned to exploit that intelligence. The Morrison property acquisition that Derek mentioned in the recorded conversation. He's been feeding information to competing bidders, ensuring they submit proposals just above your offers. The repeated failures to secure that property weren't bad luck or market competition. They were the result of systematic sabotage orchestrated by someone with access to your negotiation strategies. Elena's investigation had also uncovered the true purpose of Derek's expanding legal practice. Rather than building a legitimate client base through professional excellence, he'd been retained by investment groups and development companies specifically because of his access to inside information about Thorn Industries' operations. Derek's law firm has become essentially an intelligence-gathering operation disguised as a legal practice, Elena explained. His clients aren't paying for legal expertise. They're paying for strategic intelligence about your company's vulnerabilities and opportunities. The legal work is just a cover story to justify the financial relationships. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was evidence of Derek's long-term plan. Elena's team had uncovered communications suggesting that Derek was working with Raymond Torres to orchestrate a hostile takeover of Thorn Industries through a complex web of legal challenges, financial pressure, and regulatory harassment. "The goal isn't just to damage your company," Elena reported. "Derek and his partners are positioning themselves to acquire Thorn Industries' assets at significantly below market prices once legal and financial pressure forces you into a distressed sale situation. Jessica's inherited stake in the company would give Derek legal standing to challenge any asset transfers or defensive restructuring you might attempt." The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking in its audacity and sophistication. Derek hadn't just married into our family for access to wealth and social connections. He'd married Jessica as part of a long-term plan to steal everything I'd built over 3 decades of work. Elena's final revelation was the most personal and painful. Her surveillance had captured Derek explaining his strategy to Torres during a meeting at an exclusive club downtown. "The old man built something impressive, but he's too emotionally attached to family relationships to recognize threats from inside his own house," Derek had said, his voice carrying the casual contempt of someone discussing a business obstacle rather than a human being. "Jessica worships her father, which makes her incredibly useful for maintaining access to sensitive information. And the grandchildren ensure that Garrett will never take aggressive action against me, even when he realizes what's happening." Derek was using my love for my daughter and grandchildren as a weapon against me, calculating that my protective instincts would prevent me from exposing his criminal activities or cutting off his access to our family. He'd turned the strongest bonds in my life into vulnerabilities he could exploit without consequence. When Elena finished her presentation, I sat quietly for several minutes, processing the magnitude of Derek's betrayal and the immediate threats facing my company and family. The evidence was overwhelming, but it also presented challenges that went far beyond simple business competition. Derek wasn't just a competitor trying to gain market advantages. He was a criminal with ongoing connections to fraud networks, using my daughter and grandchildren as cover for activities that could result in federal prosecution. Any action I took against him would necessarily impact Jessica and the twins, potentially destroying family relationships that had taken decades to build. But Elena's investigation had also provided me with something Derek couldn't have anticipated: complete intelligence about his operations, his partners, and his plans. While he'd been gathering information about my vulnerabilities, I'd been mapping his entire network and documenting evidence of criminal activity that could send him to federal prison. "Elena," I said finally, "I need you to prepare 2 additional reports. The first should document Derek's activities in a format suitable for federal prosecutors, focusing on evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and any violations of securities or banking regulations. The second should be a comprehensive intelligence package about his business partners and their operations, everything we need to neutralize this network permanently." Elena nodded, already anticipating the request. "Mr. Thorne, I should warn you that exposing Derek's criminal activities will inevitably involve your daughter and grandchildren in federal investigations. Jessica may face questions about her knowledge of Derek's operations, and there could be attempts to freeze assets that are technically held jointly." It was the reality I'd been dreading since Elena first showed me evidence of Derek's betrayal. Protecting my company and ensuring justice for Derek's crimes would require actions that could devastate my family relationships and subject Jessica to legal scrutiny she didn't deserve. But as I sat in my office that evening, reviewing Elena's evidence and planning my response, I realized that Derek had made one critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that my love for Jessica would paralyze me, preventing decisive action even when faced with overwhelming evidence of his betrayal. What he didn't understand was that my love for Jessica was precisely what would drive me to act. She deserved better than a husband who was using her as cover for criminal activities. My grandchildren deserved better than a father whose actions could subject them to federal investigations and public scandal. And Jessica deserved the truth, regardless of how painful that truth might be. Derek had been playing a game where he thought emotional manipulation would guarantee his victory. But he was about to learn that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who will fight hardest to save you from your own mistakes. The war Derek had started was about to take a direction he never anticipated. The envelope I'd handed to Lawrence Fitzgerald contained a carefully curated selection of evidence from Elena Santos's investigation, just enough to demonstrate the scope of Derek's criminal activities without revealing the full extent of my knowledge about his operations. It was a tactical decision designed to force Derek into making choices while he was still operating under the assumption that his secrets remained hidden. The documents included bank records showing Derek's unexplained income from offshore accounts, photographs of his meetings with known corporate raiders and corrupt officials, and transcripts of recorded conversations where he discussed selling confidential information about Thorne Industries' operations. Most damaging was evidence of his father's criminal history and Derek's own involvement in questionable immigration law schemes, information that could trigger federal investigations into his current activities. I'd structured the evidence to create maximum psychological pressure while maintaining strategic advantages. Derek would realize that his carefully constructed background story had been exposed, but he wouldn't know how much additional intelligence I possessed about his current operations. He'd understand that I could destroy his reputation and potentially trigger criminal prosecution, but he'd be forced to guess about my intentions and timeline. Most importantly, the evidence would force Derek to confront a fundamental reality. His plan to use Jessica and the children as emotional shields had failed. By demonstrating my willingness to expose his criminal activities despite the potential impact on family relationships, I was establishing that his behavior had crossed lines that made normal family considerations irrelevant. The response came faster than I'd anticipated. Less than 6 hours after Lawrence left my office with the envelope, my phone rang. Derek's name appeared on the screen, but when I answered, his voice was barely recognizable, strained, desperate, lacking the smooth confidence that had characterized all our previous interactions. "Garrett," he said without preamble, "we need to talk." "I'm sure we do," I replied calmly, "though I'm not certain what we have to discuss that wasn't already covered in the legal documents your attorney served me today." "You don't understand," Derek said, his words coming rapidly, as if he was afraid I might hang up before he could explain. "Those papers, Jessica doesn't know about most of the demands her lawyer made. Lawrence was acting on my recommendation, but I never intended for things to escalate this way. It was a transparent attempt to distance himself from the legal action while testing how much I knew about his involvement. Derek was trying to position himself as a reasonable mediator between Jessica's supposedly independent legal action and my defensive response, hoping to maintain his cover as a concerned family member, rather than the architect of the attack. "Derek," I said quietly, "we both know that Lawrence Fitzgerald doesn't make recommendations to clients. He follows instructions from people who pay his considerable fees. If Jessica's legal demands don't reflect your guidance, then someone else has been providing that guidance, someone with detailed knowledge of my business operations and personal vulnerabilities." The silence on Derek's end stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a new note of caution, as if he was beginning to recognize that this conversation was more dangerous than he'd initially realized. "Can we meet?" he asked. "Somewhere private, away from lawyers and legal documents, family to family." "Of course," I agreed. "My office, tomorrow evening after normal business hours. Come alone." "Garrett, I think neutral territory might be—" "Derek," I interrupted, "you've been in my office countless times over the past 5 years. You've sat across from my desk discussing business strategies, family plans, and personal matters that I shared with you as a son-in-law and trusted advisor. If you're no longer comfortable in that environment, perhaps that tells us both something important about how our relationship has changed." Another long silence, then reluctantly, "Tomorrow evening, what time?" 7 o'clock. The building security staff will be expecting you." After hanging up, I spent the rest of the evening preparing for what would be either Derek's confession and attempt at negotiation, or his final performance as the wronged son-in-law trying to salvage relationships he'd never actually valued. Either way, the meeting would provide critical intelligence about his current strategy and his assessment of the threats he was facing. Elena's team had prepared my office with discreet recording equipment that would capture every word of our conversation without Derek's knowledge. More importantly, they'd positioned surveillance personnel throughout the building and surrounding area to document anyone Derek might have brought, despite my instructions, to come alone. Derek arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, dressed in an expensive suit but looking haggard in ways that suggested he'd spent the past 24 hours dealing with consequences he hadn't anticipated. When Margaret escorted him into my office, his usual confident demeanor was replaced by careful, almost submissive body language. "Garrett," he said, extending his hand as he had hundreds of times before, "thank you for agreeing to meet." I shook his hand briefly, noting that his grip was less firm than usual and his palms were slightly damp. "Please sit. Can I offer you anything to drink?" "No, thank you." Derek settled into the chair across from my desk, his eyes briefly scanning the room as if seeing it for the first time. "I want to start by saying that I never intended for our family relationship to become complicated by legal proceedings." "Derek," I said gently, "let's skip the preliminary positioning and discuss what's actually happening. You've seen the evidence in the envelope I gave to Lawrence. We both know that your background contains information you never shared with Jessica or our family. We both know that your law practice has involved activities that extend far beyond serving legitimate clients. And we both know that the legal action supposedly initiated by Jessica bears your fingerprints in ways that suggest significantly more involvement than you just claimed." Derek's careful composure cracked slightly, revealing flashes of the calculating mind that had orchestrated months of systematic betrayal. When he spoke, his voice carried less of the desperate pleading from our phone conversation and more of his natural cunning. The information in that envelope, he said slowly, represents one interpretation of activities that have perfectly legitimate explanations. My father's legal troubles don't define my character or my relationship with this family. My client relationships, regardless of how they might appear to outside observers, have never compromised my loyalty to Jessica or my respect for you. It was a lawyer's response, technically accurate but fundamentally misleading, designed to acknowledge the evidence without admitting to wrongdoing. Derek was testing whether I would accept plausible explanations for activities that we both knew were indefensible. Derek, I replied, I've spent 3 decades building relationships with people who specialize in creative interpretations of inconvenient facts. I recognize the technique you're using and I respect the skill with which you're applying it, but we're not in a courtroom, and I'm not a prosecutor who needs to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. I opened a folder on my desk and removed several photographs, placing them face up where Derek could see them clearly. His expression went through a series of rapid changes: surprise, recognition, calculation, and finally something that approached fear. The photographs showed Derek meeting with Raymond Torres, Marcus Webb, and other individuals whose involvement in his operations he'd assumed remained secret. More damaging were images taken during what Derek had believed were private conversations in supposedly secure locations. These were taken over the past 6 weeks, I explained calmly. Elena Santos and her team have been documenting your activities since October. We have recordings of conversations where you discuss selling confidential information about Thorn Industries operations. We have financial records showing payments from sources that correlate directly with setbacks my company has experienced. And we have evidence of your coordination with individuals and organizations that have been working systematically to damage my business interests. Derek stared at the photographs, his mind clearly racing as he calculated the implications of comprehensive surveillance he'd never detected. When he looked up, his expression had changed completely, the mask of concerned family member replaced by the cold assessment of someone evaluating threats and options. "What do you want?" he asked bluntly. "I want the truth," I replied. "All of it. How long you've been planning this operation, who else is involved, what your ultimate objectives are, and what arrangements you've made that might continue to threaten my family or business, even if you personally withdraw from active participation." Derek leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same intensity he'd once applied to learning my business strategies. "And in exchange for this truth? In exchange for complete cooperation and full disclosure, I might be willing to discuss arrangements that allow you to withdraw from these activities without facing federal prosecution for fraud, conspiracy, and violation of securities laws." It was a carefully constructed offer, significant enough to motivate honesty, but vague enough to avoid committing to specific terms before I understood the full scope of Derek's criminal activities. Derek was silent for nearly 5 minutes, his expression cycling through what appeared to be rapid mental calculations about risks, benefits, and alternatives. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, harder, more direct, stripped of the false warmth that had characterized our relationship for years. "The original plan was simple," he began: "marry Jessica, gain access to family financial information, and identify opportunities for profitable investments based on inside knowledge of Thorn Industries' activities. Nothing dramatic, just leveraging proximity to information that most investors can't access." He paused, as if testing my reaction to this admission of calculated manipulation of my daughter's emotions. When I remained silent, he continued, "But as I learned more about your operations, I realized that the real opportunity wasn't making money from advanced knowledge of your decisions. It was positioning myself to influence those decisions or, if necessary, replace them entirely." Derek's plan, as he explained it over the next 2 hours, was far more sophisticated and long-term than even Elena's investigation had suggested. Rather than simply stealing information for immediate profit, he'd been working to create conditions where he could gradually assume control of Thorn Industries through a combination of legal pressure, financial manipulation, and family dynamics. "Jessica inherits 40% of the company when you die or become incapacitated," Derek explained with chilling matter-of-factness. But those inheritance rights also include provisions for emergency management if the company faces certain types of legal or financial crises. By creating enough regulatory challenges, tax investigations, and civil litigation, I could trigger conditions where Jessica, as the largest stakeholder after you, would be legally entitled to assume operational control. The beauty of his strategy was its use of legitimate legal mechanisms to achieve illegitimate goals. Rather than attempting to steal assets directly, Derek had been working to create artificial crises that would force me out of control of my own company, while positioning Jessica, and by extension himself, as the solution to problems he'd secretly created. The environmental challenges on the Riverside project, the labor disputes at multiple construction sites, the zoning complications that delayed the marina development. Those weren't coincidental setbacks, Derek admitted. They were coordinated attacks designed to establish patterns of regulatory non-compliance and operational mismanagement that could be used to justify emergency interventions. Even more disturbing was Derek's manipulation of Jessica's perceptions and emotions throughout this process. He'd been feeding her carefully selected information about my business practices, framing my normal operational decisions as evidence of reckless risk-taking and potential financial mismanagement. Jessica genuinely believes that you're endangering the family's financial security through poor decision-making and stubborn refusal to adapt to changing market conditions, Derek explained. She's not aware of the external pressures that have been applied to your projects, so from her perspective, the pattern of setbacks and complications represents management failures rather than coordinated attacks. Derek had systematically isolated Jessica from objective information about Thorne Industries' operations, while providing her with interpretations of events that supported his narrative of my declining competence and increasing unreliability as a business leader. The legal action she authorized was presented to her as a protective measure, Derek continued. Lawrence convinced her that a forensic audit and formal separation of business interests would demonstrate your innocence if you were truly managing the company responsibly, while protecting family assets if the investigation uncovered evidence of mismanagement or regulatory violations. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, using Jessica's love for me and concern for her children's future to motivate actions that would ultimately serve Derek's criminal objectives while appearing to be protective measures designed in my best interests. As Derek continued his confession, describing the network of corrupt officials, predatory investors, and criminal associates he'd assembled to execute this plan, I found myself both horrified by the scope of his betrayal and impressed by the sophistication of his strategy. But Derek had made one critical miscalculation that would prove fatal to his entire operation. He'd assumed that his psychological manipulation of Jessica would prevent me from taking decisive action even when faced with overwhelming evidence of his criminal activities. He'd calculated that my desire to protect my daughter from the trauma of learning about her husband's betrayal would paralyze me, allowing his plan to continue even after I discovered it. What Derek didn't understand was that my love for Jessica was precisely what would motivate me to destroy him completely. Jessica arrived at my office the next morning, looking exhausted and confused. Her usual confidence replaced by the uncertain demeanor of someone whose fundamental assumptions about her life had been shattered overnight. Derek had clearly gone home after our meeting and attempted to prepare her for revelations he could no longer prevent, but his explanations had apparently raised more questions than they'd answered. "Dad," she said as soon as Margaret closed the door behind her, "Derek told me that you have some kind of evidence about his background, things he says he should have shared with me before we got married. He's being very vague, but he seems terrified that you're going to destroy our family over mistakes he made years ago." I gestured for her to sit in the chair Derek had occupied the previous evening, noting the irony of having this conversation in the same space where her husband had confessed to systematically betraying everything our family represented. "Jessica," I began carefully, "what Derek told you is accurate but incomplete. I do have evidence about his background, and you're right that he should have shared this information with you before your marriage. But the issues go far beyond past mistakes. They involve ongoing criminal activities that directly threaten our family and our business." Jessica's expression shifted through a series of emotions, Confusion, concern, and then something that looked like defensive anger. Criminal activities? Dad, what are you talking about? Derek's a lawyer. His practice is completely legitimate. I opened the thick folder Elena Santos had prepared, removing the most essential documents and placing them on the desk between us. Jessica, I need you to look at these carefully and ask questions about anything you don't understand. This isn't about punishing Derek for past mistakes. This is about protecting you and the children from ongoing dangers you don't know exist. The first document was Derek's real family history, including his father's criminal conviction and evidence of Derek's cooperation with federal prosecutors. Jessica read slowly, her expression growing increasingly troubled as the truth about Derek's background replaced the tragic but noble story he'd constructed. I don't understand, she said finally. Derek told me his parents died in a car accident when he was in law school. He said he had to work multiple jobs to pay for his education because he didn't have any family support. Derek's father is serving a federal prison sentence for stealing millions of dollars from elderly investors, I explained gently. Derek wasn't struggling financially during law school. He was being supported by funds that federal investigators later determined came from his father's fraud victims. When those funds were frozen during the criminal investigation, Derek cooperated with prosecutors to avoid being charged as an accomplice. I showed her bank records documenting Derek's cooperation payments from the federal government, compensation for providing evidence against his own father and other members of the fraud network. While technically legal, the records painted a picture of someone whose loyalty was determined by personal advantage rather than family bonds or ethical principles. Jessica studied the documents with the same analytical focus she'd inherited from me, asking detailed questions about dates, sources, and verification methods. I could see her mind working through the implications, comparing Derek's actual history with the stories he'd told her during their courtship and marriage. But even if Derek lied about his family background, she said slowly, that doesn't prove he's involved in criminal activities now. People have reasons for not sharing painful family histories. Maybe he was trying to protect me from worrying about connections to his father's crimes. It was a reasonable response, the kind of charitable interpretation that someone in love would naturally apply to disturbing revelations about their partner. Jessica was trying to reconcile the man she'd married with evidence that he'd systematically deceived her about fundamental aspects of his identity. You're right that past deception doesn't automatically prove current criminal activity, I agreed. But Derek's lies about his background are just the beginning of what I need to show you. I removed the next set of documents. Financial records showing Derek's unexplained income from offshore accounts, photographs of his meetings with known criminals and corrupt officials, and transcripts of recorded conversations where he discussed selling confidential information about Thorn Industries' operations. Jessica's hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the evidence, her face growing pale as the scope of Derek's betrayal became clear. When she reached the transcripts of Derek's recorded conversations, she stopped reading and looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of horror, betrayal, and dawning recognition that her entire marriage had been built on lies. This conversation, she said, pointing to a transcript where Derek discussed using her emotional attachment to me as a weakness he could exploit. When was this recorded? 6 weeks ago, I replied. The day after Emma's birthday party, when Derek spent the evening in my study asking questions about the East Side expansion project. Jessica closed her eyes, and I could see her remembering that conversation, reinterpreting Derek's apparent interest in family business through the lens of systematic intelligence gathering, rather than genuine curiosity about her father's work. He's been using me, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Using our marriage, using the children, using my relationship with you, all of it has been part of some kind of business strategy. Jessica, I said gently, Derek married you as part of a long-term plan to gain control of Thorn Industries. Your inheritance rights, your access to family information, your emotional connections to me and the business. All of these were resources he intended to exploit for financial gain. I showed her Elena's analysis of Derek's ultimate objectives, including his coordination with Raymond Torres and other corporate raiders who specialized in distressed acquisitions. Derek hadn't just been stealing information. He'd been working to create the very crises that would force Thorn Industries into vulnerable positions where his partners could acquire valuable assets at below-market prices. The environmental challenges we've faced on recent projects, the labor disputes, the regulatory complications, Derek has been providing information that enabled coordinated attacks on our business operations, I explained. Every setback we've experienced over the past 18 months has been the result of intelligence Derek gathered during family dinners, business meetings, and casual conversations where he had access to our strategic planning. Jessica spent nearly an hour reviewing the evidence, asking questions that demonstrated both her intelligence and her growing recognition that the man she'd married was fundamentally different from the person she'd believed him to be. When she finished, she sat back in her chair with an expression of exhausted defeat. "The legal papers Derek's attorney served yesterday," she said finally. "I never authorized most of those demands. Lawrence told me we were filing protective documentation to ensure the children's interests were secured if you faced business difficulties. I had no idea he was demanding control of company operations or challenging your management authority." It was the confirmation I'd expected but dreaded. Jessica had been manipulated into initiating legal action she didn't understand, used as a weapon against me by a husband who'd convinced her she was acting in the family's best interests. "Derek has been feeding you selective information about business setbacks and operational challenges," I continued, while hiding the fact that he was secretly causing many of those same problems. "From your perspective, it probably seemed like I was making increasingly poor decisions and refusing to acknowledge serious management problems." Jessica nodded slowly, tears beginning to form in her eyes as she recognized how comprehensively she'd been deceived. "He kept saying that you were too stubborn to admit when you were wrong, that your ego was preventing you from making necessary changes to protect the company. He made it sound like challenging your authority was the only way to save Thorn Industries from catastrophic mistakes. The psychological manipulation had been perfect. Derek had created the very problems he then offered to solve, while positioning himself as the voice of reason and Jessica as the protective family member trying to save me from my own poor judgment." "Dad," Jessica said, her voice breaking, "how long have you known about this?" "I began investigating Derek's activities 4 months ago, when I started noticing patterns that suggested someone with inside knowledge was working against our interests. The comprehensive evidence I've shown you today was compiled over the past 6 weeks. Jessica was quiet for several minutes, processing not just Derek's betrayal, but also the realization that I'd been conducting a secret investigation of her husband while maintaining normal family relationships and business discussions. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" she asked. "Why did you let me file legal documents and make accusations against you when you knew Derek was manipulating the situation?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been dreading since Elena's investigation first confirmed my worst suspicions about Derek's activities. "Jessica, I needed comprehensive evidence before making accusations that would destroy your marriage and potentially subject you and the children to federal investigations. Derek's activities involve financial fraud, conspiracy, and potential violations of securities laws. Exposing him means exposing networks of criminal associates who might face prosecution. I also needed to be certain that Jessica had been manipulated rather than complicit in Derek's activities. While I'd never believed my daughter would knowingly participate in criminal conspiracies, the legal implications of Derek's fraud schemes meant that anyone with knowledge of his activities could potentially face charges as an accessory or co-conspirator. More importantly, I continued, I needed Derek to believe his plan was succeeding. As long as he thought his manipulation was working, he continued providing evidence of criminal activity that could be used to ensure complete legal victory and protect our family from future threats. Jessica's expression shifted from hurt to something approaching understanding. "You were gathering evidence to destroy him completely." "I was gathering evidence to protect you and the children completely," I corrected. "Derek's criminal associates don't disappear just because he withdraws from their operations. As long as networks of corrupt officials and predatory investors view our family as a profitable target, We remain vulnerable to future attacks. Jessica sat quietly, staring at the evidence scattered across my desk. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but filled with a resolve I hadn't heard since she was a teenager facing difficult decisions about her future. "What happens now?" she asked. "What happens to Derek, to the children, to our family?" "That depends on choices Derek makes over the next few days," I replied. "I've offered him an opportunity to cooperate fully with federal investigators in exchange for consideration regarding prosecution. If he provides complete information about his criminal associates and helps law enforcement dismantle the networks he's been working with, he might avoid prison time. And if he doesn't cooperate, then Elena's evidence goes to federal prosecutors, and Derek faces charges that could result in decades in federal prison. His criminal associates will likely eliminate him as a potential witness against them, which means he'll be fighting legal battles on multiple fronts without the resources or protection that cooperation with law enforcement would provide." Jessica absorbed this information with the same analytical approach she'd applied to reviewing the evidence against Derek. She was clearly processing not just the immediate implications for her marriage, but the long-term consequences for her children and their relationship with their father. "Dad," she said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course." "If Derek cooperates with federal investigators and helps them prosecute his associates, will you be able to forgive him for what he's done to our family?" It was the question I'd been asking myself since Elena first presented evidence of Derek's systematic betrayal. Derek hadn't just committed crimes. He'd weaponized the love and trust of his own family, using his wife and children as tools in a criminal conspiracy designed to destroy everything I'd built. "Jessica," I said carefully, "forgiveness and trust are different things. I might eventually be able to forgive Derek for the choices he's made, but I will never again trust him with information that could be used to harm our family or business. If Derek cooperates with law enforcement and withdraws completely from criminal activities, he could potentially rebuild a relationship with you and the children. But his relationship with me and his access to Thorn Industries operations are finished permanently." Jessica nodded, apparently satisfied with an answer that acknowledged the reality of irreparably damaged relationships, while leaving room for her to make her own decisions about her marriage and her children's relationship with their father. "I want to talk to Derek tonight," she said. "I want to give him a chance to explain his actions and tell me directly what he plans to do about cooperating with federal investigators." "Jessica, Derek's criminal associates represent serious threats to anyone they perceive as obstacles to their operations. If Derek decides not to cooperate with law enforcement, you and the children could become targets for intimidation or worse." Jessica's expression hardened with a determination that reminded me of her mother during the most challenging periods of building our family and business. "Dad, Derek made these choices without considering the consequences for his wife and children. He doesn't get to use our safety as an excuse for avoiding responsibility for his crimes." It was exactly the response I'd hoped for but hadn't dared expect. Jessica had not only recognized the scope of Derek's betrayal, she was prepared to prioritize her children's long-term welfare over short-term emotional considerations or misplaced loyalty to a husband who'd systematically deceived her. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Give Derek exactly the choice you described. Full cooperation with federal investigators in exchange for consideration regarding prosecution, or face the consequences of his criminal activities without family protection or financial support." Jessica stood up, gathering her composure with visible effort. "And Dad, when this is over, when Derek has made his decision and we've dealt with whatever consequences follow, I want to be involved in Thorn Industries operations in ways that ensure nothing like this can ever happen again." As she left my office, I felt a mixture of pride and sadness that would characterize the next several months of our lives. Derek's betrayal had cost us innocence and trust that could never be fully recovered, but it had also revealed strength and wisdom in Jessica that would serve our family well in whatever challenges lay ahead. The next phase of this conflict would determine not just Derek's fate, but the future of our family and the business empire I'd spent 3 decades building. Derek's response came 48 hours later, delivered not through a phone call or meeting request, but through an action that demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation he was facing. Lawrence Fitzgerald appeared in my office lobby at 9 a.m. sharp, accompanied this time not by his nervous associate, but by two federal marshals and a man I recognized as Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Rodriguez. Rodriguez was known throughout Seattle's legal community for his aggressive prosecution of white-collar criminals and his particular expertise in financial fraud cases. Margaret buzzed my intercom with obvious concern in her voice. "Mr. Thorne, there are federal officers in the lobby requesting an immediate meeting with you. They have warrants." I'd been expecting this development since Derek failed to contact me within the time frame I'd established for his decision about cooperation. Rather than accepting my offer to work with federal investigators voluntarily, Derek had apparently decided to go on the offensive, hoping to frame me as the criminal while positioning himself as a whistleblower exposing corporate fraud. "Send them up, Margaret," I replied calmly. "And please contact Elena Santos immediately. Tell her the federal phase of our operation has begun ahead of schedule." When the group entered my office, Rodriguez took the lead with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to intimidating white-collar defendants into quick settlements or confessions. "Mr. Thorne," he began without preamble, "I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Rodriguez. These gentlemen are Deputy Marshals Harrison and Webb. We're here to execute search warrants for this office and your residence in connection with an ongoing federal investigation into allegations of fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to manipulate municipal contracting processes." He handed me a thick stack of legal documents while the marshals began positioning themselves to prevent any attempt to destroy evidence or flee the scene. Rodriguez's demeanor suggested he expected me to react with either panic or indignation, the typical responses of guilty executives caught in criminal investigations. Instead, I reviewed the search warrants carefully, noting their scope and the specific allegations that had triggered the federal investigation. Derek's strategy was immediately clear. He'd provided prosecutors with a carefully constructed narrative that portrayed me as the mastermind behind the very criminal activities he'd been orchestrating. "These warrants reference allegations made by a confidential informant," I observed, looking up at Rodriguez. "I assume this informant has provided specific evidence of the criminal activities described in these documents?" Rodriguez's expression was carefully neutral, but his slight hesitation suggested that Derek's evidence might be less compelling than these warrants implied. "Mr. Thorne, I'm not at liberty to discuss the details of our ongoing investigation. However, I can tell you that we have substantial evidence of systematic fraud involving Thorne Industries operations over the past 3 years." "Of course," I replied, walking to my desk and removing the comprehensive file Elena Santos had prepared for exactly this scenario. "Before your investigation proceeds, there are some materials you should review, evidence that might provide important context for whatever allegations your confidential informant has made." Rodriguez frowned, clearly not expecting cooperative behavior from someone whose office was being searched by federal agents. "Mr. Thorne, anything you want to say should be discussed with your attorney present. I strongly advise you not to make any statements about matters related to this investigation." "I'm not making statements," I replied, handing him Elena's file. "I'm providing evidence that my private investigators have compiled regarding criminal activities targeting Thorne Industries. Evidence that includes recorded conversations, financial records, and photographic surveillance of individuals who have been working systematically to damage my company's operations." Rodriguez opened the file reluctantly, his expression shifting from professional skepticism to genuine surprise as he reviewed the first few documents. The evidence Elena had compiled was far more comprehensive and better organized than most materials federal investigators received from private sources. "Mr. Thorne," Rodriguez said carefully, "some of this evidence appears to involve the same individuals and activities referenced in our current investigation. How long have you been conducting this private investigation?" 4 months, I replied. "We began gathering evidence when we noticed patterns suggesting that someone with inside knowledge of our operations was working with external parties to create systematic business disruptions." I gestured toward the conference table in my office. "Gentlemen, if you'll take a few minutes to review that file, I believe you'll find that your confidential informant may have provided you with information that's not entirely accurate. In fact, your informant appears to be the primary subject of criminal activity, rather than a witness to crimes committed by others. Rodriguez spent nearly an hour reviewing Elena's evidence while the federal marshals conducted their search of my office files and computer systems. Lawrence Fitzgerald sat silently in the corner, his usual arrogant confidence replaced by obvious concern, as Rodriguez examined documentation that contradicted whatever story Derek had provided to federal prosecutors. When Rodriguez finished reviewing the file, his demeanor toward me had changed completely. Instead of treating me as a criminal suspect, he was now evaluating me as a potential cooperating witness in a case that was far more complex than Derek's initial allegations had suggested. "Mr. Thorne," he said finally, "the evidence you've provided raises serious questions about the reliability of information we've received from our confidential source. Before we proceed with this search, I'd like to arrange a formal interview where you can provide detailed testimony about your private investigation and the individuals involved in these alleged criminal activities." "I'd be happy to provide complete cooperation," I replied, "but I should mention that my private investigators have additional evidence that might be relevant to your inquiry, including recorded conversations where your confidential informant discusses criminal activities with known associates." Rodriguez's expression hardened as the implications became clear. Derek hadn't just provided false information to federal prosecutors. He'd potentially committed additional crimes by lying to federal agents and attempting to manipulate an ongoing investigation. "We'll need to review all available evidence before proceeding," Rodriguez said, his tone now completely professional rather than adversarial. "Mr. Thorne, I'm suspending this search pending further investigation of the materials you've provided. We'll be in contact within 48 hours to schedule formal interviews with you and your investigative team." After the federal agents left, Lawrence Fitzgerald remained in my office, his composure completely shattered by the realization that Derek's strategy had not only failed, but had potentially created federal criminal liability for attempting to obstruct justice. "Garrett," he said quietly, "my client may have misrepresented certain facts when he approached federal prosecutors about this matter." "Lawrence," I replied calmly, "your client has committed multiple federal crimes, including fraud, conspiracy, and now obstruction of justice. The question is whether Derek wants to minimize his legal exposure through complete cooperation, or whether he prefers to face prosecution for the full scope of his criminal activities." Lawrence was silent for several minutes, clearly calculating the legal implications of Derek's decision to attack me through federal prosecutors rather than accepting my offer of negotiated resolution. "What would complete cooperation involve?" he asked finally. "Derek provides detailed testimony about every aspect of his criminal network, including all financial transactions, all meetings with corrupt officials, and all activities designed to damage Thorne Industries' operations. He surrenders all assets obtained through criminal activities and agrees to permanent restraining orders, preventing any future contact with my family or business operations. And in exchange, federal prosecutors receive my complete cooperation in dismantling the criminal networks Derek has been working with, including recorded conversations, financial records, and photographic surveillance of key participants. Derek's cooperation might result in reduced charges, but he will serve some prison time and will be permanently barred from practicing law." Lawrence nodded slowly, recognizing that Derek's options had been reduced to choosing between limited cooperation with harsh consequences or complete prosecution with devastating consequences. "I need to discuss these terms with my client immediately," he said, gathering his materials with obvious urgency. "Lawrence," I added as he reached the door, "Derek should understand that his attempt to manipulate federal prosecutors has eliminated any possibility of lenient treatment. His cooperation is no longer a favor we're requesting. It's a legal necessity if he wants to avoid spending the next 20 years in federal prison." After Lawrence left, I called Elena Santos to coordinate our response to Derek's failed offensive strategy. "The federal investigation is proceeding exactly as we anticipated," I reported. "Derek's attempt to frame me as a criminal has backfired completely. Rodriguez is now treating our evidence as the primary foundation for prosecuting Derek and his associates. What about Jessica and the children? Elena asked. Jessica has been remarkably strong throughout this process. She's prepared to support Derek's prosecution if that's what's necessary to protect the family from his criminal associates. And Derek's likely response to these new developments? Derek has 48 hours to decide whether he wants to cooperate voluntarily or be arrested and charged with the full scope of his criminal activities. Either way, his ability to threaten our family or business is finished. That evening, I sat in my study reviewing the events of the past 6 months and preparing for whatever final confrontation Derek might attempt before accepting the reality of his situation. His systematic betrayal had been sophisticated and potentially devastating, but it had also revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the people and principles he'd been fighting against. Derek had assumed that business success was primarily about manipulation and exploitation, that the relationships and trust I'd built over 3 decades could be destroyed through clever legal strategies and psychological warfare. What he'd never understood was that true success is built on foundations that can't be undermined by people who lack genuine integrity and long-term vision. The phone rang just before midnight. Jessica's name appeared on the caller ID. "Dad," she said without preamble, "Derek's gone. He left about 2 hours ago with a suitcase and some cash. He said to tell you that he's not going to prison for mistakes that other people made, and that you'll regret forcing him into impossible choices." It was Derek's final mistake, fleeing rather than cooperating, confirming his guilt while eliminating his only chance for reduced charges through voluntary testimony. "Jessica," I said gently, "Derek has just guaranteed that he'll face the maximum penalties for all of his criminal activities. Are you and the children safe?" "We're fine. I've taken the twins to stay with Mom's sister in Portland. Derek doesn't know where we are, and I've changed all the security codes and account passwords he might have access to." Jessica had made the transition from victim of Derek's manipulation to active participant in protecting our family from his criminal activities. Her strength and decisiveness in crisis situations reminded me of all the reasons I'd fought so hard to protect her from Derek's betrayal. "Dad," she continued, "there's something else Derek said before he left. He said that his associates won't just disappear because he's no longer working with them, and that our family will always be a target for people who view Thorn Industries as a profitable opportunity. It was a threat designed to create ongoing fear and uncertainty, but it was also an acknowledgement that Derek's criminal network viewed our family wealth as a permanent target for future schemes. Jessica, Elena's investigation has provided federal prosecutors with comprehensive intelligence about Derek's criminal associates. Over the next 6 months, most of these networks will be dismantled through coordinated prosecutions. The threats Derek is referencing will be eliminated along with the people making them. And Derek himself? Derek will be arrested within days and charged with multiple federal crimes. His decision to flee rather than cooperate has eliminated any possibility of lenient treatment. He'll spend many years in federal prison, and his associates will likely view him as a liability rather than an asset. Jessica was quiet for several minutes, processing the reality that her husband had chosen criminal flight over family responsibility, confirming every terrible revelation about his character and priorities. "Dad," she said finally, "when this is all over, when Derek has been arrested and his associates have been prosecuted, I want to be involved in Thorn Industries operations in ways that ensure our family business can never again be vulnerable to this kind of internal betrayal. Jessica, you'll have whatever role in the company you want, and whatever authority you need to protect our family's interests. And I want Emma and Jack to grow up understanding that family loyalty means protecting each other from people who would use our relationships as weapons against us." It was a hard lesson for young children to learn, but Jessica was right that our grandchildren needed to understand the difference between genuine family bonds and the kind of manipulative relationships that Derek had cultivated throughout his time with us. As I hung up the phone, I reflected on the irony of Derek's final strategy. His attempt to destroy our family through legal and criminal manipulation had instead strengthened our relationships and clarified our priorities in ways that might never have happened without the crisis he'd created. Derek had assumed that threatening our family bonds would paralyze us with fear and uncertainty. Instead, his betrayal had taught us that some relationships are strong enough to survive any external pressure, while others reveal themselves to be hollow constructions that collapse under the weight of truth. The next phase of this conflict would involve federal prosecution of Derek and his criminal associates, but the most important battle, the fight for our family's integrity and future, had already been won. Derek's arrest came 6 days later, captured by news cameras outside a budget motel in Spokane, where he'd been hiding with false identification and approximately $40,000 in cash. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd lived in luxury while systematically stealing from my family was reduced to fleeing like a common criminal, staying in the kind of establishment he'd never have acknowledged during his years of pretending to be a respectable attorney. Elena Santos called me within an hour of Derek's apprehension, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose professional instincts had been validated by results. Federal agents found evidence in Derek's motel room that confirms everything we documented about his criminal network, she reported. Financial records, communication logs, and contact information for corrupt officials in 3 states. Derek apparently kept detailed records of his criminal activities, probably as insurance against his associates. The evidence Derek had maintained for his own protection had become the foundation for the largest public corruption investigation in Washington state history. Within days of his arrest, federal prosecutors had issued indictments for 17 individuals, including Raymond Torres, Marcus Webb, and several other corrupt officials who'd been facilitating Derek's attacks on Thorne Industries and other legitimate businesses. More importantly, Elena continued, Derek's flight and arrest have completely vindicated your decision-making throughout this crisis. Federal prosecutors are treating you as the victim of criminal conspiracy rather than a subject of investigation. Your reputation in the business community has actually been enhanced by this entire ordeal. It was an outcome I'd hoped for, but hadn't dared expect. Derek's systematic betrayal could have destroyed my business reputation and family relationships, even if his criminal activities had ultimately been exposed. Instead, his overreach and tactical mistakes had created a situation where his defeat strengthened everything he'd tried to damage. The public response was swift and decisive. Clients who'd been concerned about Thorne Industries' recent setbacks now understood that those difficulties had been artificially created by criminal sabotage rather than management failures. New business opportunities materialized as other companies sought to associate themselves with an organization that had successfully defended itself against sophisticated criminal attacks. Most satisfying was the response from Seattle's political and business leadership. Rather than distancing themselves from potential scandal, influential figures throughout the community reached out to express support and admiration for the way I'd handled Derek's betrayal. Mayor Patricia Hendricks called personally to commend my cooperation with federal investigators and to assure me that city contracts would continue to be awarded based on merit rather than political considerations. Garrett, she said during our conversation, what Derek and his associates tried to do to your company represents exactly the kind of corruption we've been fighting against for years. Your willingness to document their activities and cooperate with federal prosecutors has helped us clean up problems that have been damaging legitimate businesses throughout the region. Jessica's response to Derek's arrest was more complex, reflecting the emotional challenges of seeing the father of her children led away in handcuffs while simultaneously feeling relief that his threats could no longer impact our family. I keep thinking about Emma and Jack, she told me during one of our conversations in the weeks following Derek's arrest. How do I explain to them that their father is in prison because he tried to steal money from their grandfather? How do I help them understand that Derek's crimes don't define their worth or their future? It was a question that would shape our family relationships for years to come. Emma and Jack were still too young to understand the legal complexities of their father's crimes, but they were old enough to sense that something fundamental had changed in their world. Jessica, I replied, we tell them age-appropriate versions of the truth, and we demonstrate through our actions that families can survive difficult challenges by supporting each other and maintaining their values. I'm worried that they'll blame themselves, or blame me for not protecting them from Derek's choices. Children are more resilient than we often realize, and they're also more perceptive. Emma and Jack will eventually understand that Derek's crimes were his responsibility alone, and that the adults in their lives who truly care about them fought to protect them from consequences they didn't deserve. Jessica had begun the difficult process of rebuilding her life and identity, independent of Derek's manipulation and criminal activities. The strength and intelligence she'd inherited from both sides of our family were emerging more clearly as she took on greater responsibilities in Thorn Industries operations while managing the challenges of single parenthood. "Dad," she said during one of our strategic planning meetings, "I want to establish new security protocols for family involvement in business operations. Background checks, regular reviews of financial activities, and clear boundaries between family relationships and business responsibilities." It was exactly the kind of systematic thinking that would prevent future infiltration by people like Derek, while maintaining the family culture that had made Thorn Industries successful for 3 decades. Derek's trial began 8 months later, generating significant media attention as federal prosecutors unveiled the scope of his criminal conspiracy and its impact on numerous legitimate businesses throughout the Pacific Northwest. The evidence Elena's investigation had provided proved to be the foundation for a prosecution that exposed corruption reaching into city government, state regulatory agencies, and multiple financial institutions. Derek's defense strategy was predictable but ineffective, claiming that he'd been manipulated by more sophisticated criminals who'd exploited his financial desperation and family obligations. His attorneys painted him as a naive young lawyer who'd gotten in over his head with dangerous people, emphasizing his cooperation with prosecutors and his willingness to testify against his former associates. The strategy might have generated sympathy if Derek hadn't also been caught on Elena's recordings, discussing his manipulation of Jessica and his plans to use our grandchildren as emotional leverage against me. When federal prosecutors played audio of Derek explaining how he'd weaponized family relationships for criminal gain, any possibility of portraying him as a victim disappeared. Defendant Castellano demonstrated sophisticated understanding of complex financial fraud schemes, Assistant U.S. Attorney Rodriguez argued during closing arguments. His recorded statements reveal calculated manipulation of family relationships and systematic exploitation of trust placed in him by legitimate business partners. This was not naive involvement with dangerous associates. This was leadership of criminal activities designed to steal millions of dollars from victims who considered him family. Derek was convicted on 14 federal charges, including fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. His sentence of 18 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 12 years effectively ended any chance that he would be a significant presence in Emma and Jack's lives during their formative years. The sentences for Derek's associates were even more severe. Raymond Torres received 25 years for racketeering and multiple fraud convictions. Marcus Webb was sentenced to 15 years and permanent disbarment from holding any government position. 7 other members of the criminal network received sentences ranging from 8 to 20 years, while 4 additional conspirators agreed to cooperate with ongoing investigations in exchange for reduced charges. More importantly, the federal prosecution had dismantled the entire network of corruption that had been targeting legitimate businesses throughout the region. The artificial obstacles that companies like Thorn Industries had been facing, delayed permits, frivolous environmental challenges, coordinated labor disputes, ended abruptly as the criminals responsible for orchestrating these attacks were removed from positions where they could continue their activities. Jessica attended Derek's sentencing hearing, not to support her former husband, but to provide victim impact testimony about the ways his crimes had affected our family, and particularly the children he'd claimed to love. Derek Castellano didn't just steal money, she told the court during her statement. He stole trust, security, and innocence from his own children. He used their love for him as a weapon against family members who had welcomed him and supported his career. His crimes have forced Emma and Jack to grow up without their father, not because of accidents or illnesses they couldn't control, but because their father chose criminal activity over family responsibility. It was a powerful statement that articulated the personal costs of Derek's betrayal more effectively than financial damage assessments or business disruption calculations could convey. When Derek was given an opportunity to make a statement before sentencing, his words revealed that he still didn't fully understand the magnitude of his crimes or their impact on the people who'd trusted him. "I made mistakes," he said, "but I never intended to hurt my family or cause permanent damage to anyone's business. I was trying to build security for my wife and children in a competitive industry where success often requires taking risks that more established companies can afford to avoid." It was classic Derek, acknowledging wrongdoing while minimizing responsibility, framing criminal activities as misguided attempts to serve family interests rather than systematic betrayal of family trust. Judge Margaret Sullivan's response was swift and unforgiving. "Mr. Castellano, your recorded statements demonstrate that you understood exactly what you were doing and who would be harmed by your activities. You systematically exploited the trust and love of family members who had supported your career and welcomed you into their lives. Your crimes weren't mistakes. They were calculated betrayals that have caused lasting damage to people who deserved your protection, not your exploitation." As Derek was led away to begin his federal prison sentence, I felt not triumph or satisfaction, but rather a deep sadness for opportunities that had been wasted and relationships that could never be restored. Derek had possessed intelligence, charm, and professional skills that could have created legitimate success and genuine happiness for himself and his family. Instead, he'd chosen to weaponize those gifts for criminal gain, destroying everything good in his life while creating lasting trauma for people who'd loved him. But Derek's downfall had also revealed strengths in our family that I hadn't fully appreciated before his betrayal forced us to defend everything we valued. Jessica had demonstrated wisdom, courage, and leadership that positioned her to eventually assume control of Thorn Industries with confidence and competence. Emma and Jack had shown resilience and adaptability that suggested they would grow up strong enough to handle whatever challenges their father's crimes might create for them. Most importantly, the crisis Derek had created had clarified priorities and relationships in ways that might never have happened without external pressure. We'd learned that some family bonds are strong enough to survive any test, while others reveal themselves to be shallow constructions that collapse when subjected to real stress. 2 years after Derek's sentencing, Thorn Industries had not only recovered from the systematic sabotage we'd endured, but had expanded into new markets and achieved record profitability. The federal prosecution of Derek's criminal network had eliminated artificial obstacles that had been constraining legitimate businesses throughout the region, creating opportunities for companies with genuine expertise and ethical business practices. Jessica had assumed the role of Chief Operating Officer, bringing fresh perspectives to operations while maintaining the core values and strategic principles that had built our success over 3 decades. Her experience surviving Derek's manipulation had given her invaluable insights into identifying and preventing future security threats, both external and internal. The background investigation protocols we've implemented would have detected Derek's deception before he ever gained access to sensitive information, she explained during a board meeting where we were reviewing new security measures. But more importantly, the cultural changes we've made ensure that no individual, regardless of family relationships or professional credentials, can accumulate the kind of unchecked access that enabled Derek's betrayal. Emma and Jack, now 7 years old, had adapted to their father's absence with the resilience that children often demonstrate when supported by stable, loving family structures. They understood that Derek was away because he'd made bad choices that hurt people, but their daily lives were filled with the activities, attention, and emotional security that healthy childhood development requires. They asked questions about Derek occasionally, Jessica reported during one of our Sunday dinners. But they seemed more curious than upset. I think having consistent explanations and being surrounded by adults who clearly love and protect them has prevented the kind of trauma I was worried about. Elena Santos had expanded her investigation agency significantly, partly based on the reputation she'd gained from successfully exposing Derek's criminal network. She'd also become something of a specialist in family security issues, helping other wealthy families identify and neutralize threats from people attempting to exploit personal relationships for criminal gain. What Derek attempted against your family wasn't unique, she told me during a follow-up meeting. Predatory individuals specifically target successful families, using marriage, friendship, and business partnerships to gain access to information and assets they can steal or manipulate. The key to prevention is recognizing that some relationships are strategic rather than genuine, and implementing verification processes that don't depend entirely on trust. Derek himself had largely disappeared from public attention, serving his federal sentence at a medium security facility in Oregon. According to reports from his probation officers, he'd been a model prisoner, participating in educational programs and maintaining minimal contact with the outside world. Whether this represented genuine rehabilitation or simply strategic behavior designed to improve his chances for early release remained unclear. He writes letters to the children occasionally, Jessica mentioned during one of our conversations. Birthday cards, holiday greetings, that kind of thing. I've been saving them without showing them to Emma and Jack. I figure they can decide when they're older whether they want to read messages from their father. It was a wise approach, maintaining the possibility of future reconciliation while protecting the children from manipulation or emotional confusion they weren't mature enough to handle. Lawrence Fitzgerald had faced professional consequences for his role in Derek's schemes. Though he'd avoided criminal prosecution by cooperating with federal investigators and demonstrating that he'd been misled about the true nature of Derek's activities, rather than actively participating in criminal conspiracy. His law firm had lost several major clients and faced civil lawsuits from people damaged by Derek's crimes, but Lawrence had managed to maintain his license and continue practicing in a reduced capacity. I should have recognized warning signs in Derek's behavior and the evidence he provided, Lawrence admitted during a deposition for civil litigation. My failure to verify his claims and investigate the source of his information contributed to legal actions that caused unnecessary harm to innocent parties. The broader impact of Derek's prosecution had extended far beyond our family's immediate concerns. The federal investigation had exposed systematic corruption in Seattle's development approval process, leading to reforms that made the entire system more transparent and accountable. Several major development projects that had been stalled by artificial obstacles were able to proceed, creating jobs and economic benefits for the entire region. Mayor Patricia Hendricks had established new oversight mechanisms for city government interactions with private developers, explicitly designed to prevent the kind of corrupt relationships that Derek and his associates had exploited. The Castellano investigation revealed vulnerabilities in our regulatory processes that criminal networks had been exploiting for years, she explained during a press conference announcing the reforms. The changes we're implementing will make it much more difficult for corrupt officials to manipulate legitimate business operations while ensuring that environmental and safety concerns continue to receive appropriate attention. My own reputation in the business community had been enhanced rather than damaged by Derek's attack and ultimate prosecution. Other executives viewed my response to Derek's betrayal as a model for defending against sophisticated threats, and several organizations had requested presentations about corporate security and family business protection strategies. What Garrett Thorne accomplished was remarkable, not just because he exposed criminal activity, but because he managed the crisis in ways that protected his family while ensuring that justice was served, noted Business Journal columnist Patricia Wagner in an article about executive crisis management. His ability to gather evidence systematically, coordinate with law enforcement effectively, and maintain operational stability throughout a complex investigation demonstrates the kind of leadership that builds lasting success. But the most significant changes had occurred within our family structure and relationships. The crisis Derek had created had forced us to examine assumptions, clarify priorities, and strengthen bonds in ways that might never have happened without external pressure. Jessica's relationship with her children had deepened as she'd taken on the full responsibilities of single parenthood while managing increasing professional duties. Emma and Jack had developed unusual maturity and self-reliance, partly because their family situation had required them to understand that actions have consequences, and that people must be judged by their behavior rather than their promises. They're more thoughtful about relationships than most children their age, Jessica observed. When they meet new people, they watch how those people treat others and whether their actions match their words. I think Derek's betrayal taught them lessons about trust and character that will serve them well throughout their lives. My own relationship with Jessica had evolved into something more like a partnership between peers, rather than traditional parent-child dynamics. Her experience surviving Derek's manipulation and contributing to his prosecution had demonstrated capabilities and judgment that positioned her to eventually assume full leadership of Thorne Industries with complete confidence. "Dad," she said during one of our strategic planning sessions, "I want to establish a foundation that helps families who've been victimized by people exploiting personal relationships for criminal gain. Legal support, counseling services, financial assistance, resources that aren't always available through traditional victim support programs." It was exactly the kind of initiative that would create positive outcomes from the trauma Derek had inflicted on our family while helping other people facing similar betrayals. We could partner with Elena's agency to provide investigative services for families who suspect manipulation, but don't have resources for comprehensive background investigations, I suggested, and work with federal prosecutors to ensure that criminal networks targeting family businesses are pursued aggressively. The foundation Jessica established, named the Innocence Protection Initiative, had become a model for family-focused victim services, providing support for dozens of families who'd faced betrayal by trusted relatives, business partners, or romantic interests. The program's success had attracted attention from federal law enforcement agencies and victim advocacy groups throughout the country. 3 years after Derek's sentencing, I received an unexpected phone call from Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Rodriguez, who'd led the prosecution of Derek's criminal network. "Garrett," he said, "I wanted to give you advance notice about a development in the Castellano case. Derek has petitioned for sentence reduction based on his cooperation with ongoing investigations and his participation in prison educational programs. The petition includes a request for supervised release that would allow him to have limited contact with his children. It was a possibility we'd always known might arise, though Derek's cooperation with investigators had been limited, and his educational participation appeared motivated more by self-interest than genuine rehabilitation." "What's your assessment of the petition's likelihood of success?" I asked. "Minimal," Rodriguez replied. "Derek's cooperation provided useful information about criminal networks that had already been largely dismantled through our investigation. His prison behavior has been acceptable but not exceptional. More importantly, victim impact statements from your family emphasize the ongoing emotional trauma that his crimes created for his children." "And if the petition were granted?" "Any supervised release would include strict conditions preventing unsupervised contact with minors, prohibited contact with you or Jessica without court approval, and geographic restrictions that would keep him away from Seattle and your business operations." Jessica's response to news of Derek's petition was measured and thoughtful, reflecting the emotional growth she demonstrated throughout this ordeal. "I want Emma and Jack to have the opportunity to know their father if they choose to, but only under circumstances that prioritize their welfare over Derek's desires," she told me. "If Derek has genuinely changed and wants to rebuild relationships with his children, he can demonstrate that through supervised visits and consistent responsible behavior over time." Emma and Jack, now 10 years old, had developed their own perspectives about their father's situation. When Jessica explained that Derek might be allowed supervised visits in the future, their responses revealed remarkable emotional maturity. "Will he try to take us away from you and Grandpa?" Emma asked, her concern focused on protecting the family structure that provided her security rather than curiosity about her absent father. "No," Jessica assured her. "Any visits would be supervised by adults whose job is to make sure you're safe and comfortable. You would never be required to spend time with Derek if you didn't want to." Jack's response was more practical. "If Derek visits, will he tell us why he made bad choices? I want to understand what he was thinking." It was exactly the kind of question that demonstrated how Derek's crimes had accelerated his children's emotional and intellectual development. in ways that might ultimately serve them well in adult relationships and professional challenges. Derek's petition for sentence reduction was ultimately denied, though federal prosecutors indicated that future applications might be considered if he demonstrated sustained rehabilitation and if his children expressed interest in supervised contact when they reached adolescence. For now, our family had achieved the stability and security that Derek's betrayal had threatened to destroy. Thorne Industries continued expanding and succeeding in competitive markets. Jessica's leadership abilities were developing in ways that ensured continuity of family business values across generations. Emma and Jack were growing up with strong moral foundations and realistic understanding of human nature. Most importantly, we'd learned that some family bonds are strong enough to survive any external pressure, while also recognizing that those bonds require constant attention, honest communication, and willingness to make difficult choices when necessary. Derek had intended to destroy everything our family represented in order to steal everything we'd built. Instead, his betrayal had strengthened our relationships, clarified our values, and prepared us for whatever future challenges might arise. In the end, Derek's greatest crime wasn't stealing money or damaging business operations. It was underestimating the people he'd betrayed and overestimating his ability to manipulate relationships built on genuine love and mutual respect. 5 years after Derek's sentencing, as I sat in my study reviewing the quarterly reports that showed Thorne Industries achieving its most successful period in company history, I reflected on the profound ways that Derek's betrayal had ultimately transformed our family and business for the better. The crisis Derek created had forced us to examine every aspect of our operations, relationships, and security practices with unprecedented scrutiny. What emerged from that examination was an organization stronger, more resilient, and more ethically grounded than anything we'd built during the previous 3 decades. Jessica, now serving as president and CEO designate, had implemented comprehensive reforms that went far beyond simple security measures. Her experience surviving Derek's psychological manipulation had given her unique insights into identifying and preventing future threats while maintaining the family culture and business relationships that had made Thorne Industries successful. The protocols we've established aren't just about background checks and financial monitoring, she explained during a presentation to the National Association of Family Businesses. They're about creating organizational cultures where genuine integrity is rewarded and manipulative behavior is recognized and addressed before it can cause damage. Emma and Jack, now 12 years old, had grown into remarkably resilient and perceptive young people. Their early exposure to adult consequences for unethical behavior had accelerated their moral development in ways that positioned them to navigate complex social and professional challenges with unusual wisdom. They ask sophisticated questions about business ethics and personal relationships, Jessica noted during one of our family discussions. Questions that demonstrate they understand the difference between people who earn trust through consistent behavior and people who manipulate trust for personal advantage. The children had also developed strong bonds with Elena Santos, who'd become something of a family friend and mentor figure. Elena's background in federal law enforcement and corporate investigations provided them with perspectives on personal security and threat assessment that most children never receive. Emma asked me last week whether she should be worried about people trying to befriend her because of our family's wealth, Elena mentioned during a security review meeting. When I explained how to recognize potentially manipulative behavior, she said it sounded similar to techniques Derek had used with Jessica. These children are going to be very difficult to deceive or exploit as they grow older. Derek himself remained largely absent from public attention, serving his federal sentence with minimal contact with the outside world. According to correctional officials, he'd participated in various educational and counseling programs, though whether this reflected genuine rehabilitation or strategic behavior designed to improve his chances for eventual release remained unclear. He sends birthday cards to Emma and Jack each year, Jessica reported, but he stopped attempting to contact me directly. I think he finally understands that any future relationship with his children will depend entirely on their choices and his ability to demonstrate consistent responsible behavior over many years. The broader impact of Derek's prosecution had continued expanding far beyond our family's immediate concerns. The federal investigation had triggered reforms in municipal government, regulatory oversight, and business ethics training that had benefited the entire regional economy. Mayor Patricia Hendricks had established the Derek Castellano Memorial Ethics Program, named ironically to honor the positive changes that resulted from his criminal prosecution rather than celebrating his life or career. The program provided ethics training for all city employees, established anonymous reporting mechanisms for potential corruption, and created independent oversight of major development projects. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from negative examples, Mayor Hendricks explained during the program's inaugural ceremony. Derek Castellano's crimes demonstrated how corrupt relationships can damage,